Welcome to the South Orange Report. I'm Andrea Fant-Hobbs, and we report on the leadership and lifestyle in South Orange. And today I am pleased to be joined by Nancy Gagne, the Executive Director of the South Orange Maplewood Coalition on Race, and Reverend Dr. Terry L. Richardson, pastor of the First Baptist Church of South Orange. So thank you both for joining me on a very hazy, hot, and humid evening. Happy that you guys are here.
Happy to be here.
My pleasure.
We have had in our country some tremendous tragedies of late. And it seems as though just as we are trying to equalize from one, yet another takes place. And I'm speaking of the recent tragedy in Charleston, South Carolina. And I'd like for us to talk about that and how do we begin to respond and react as a community, in a community such as ours, one who prides itself on its inclusivity, and we celebrate racial diversity here. So how do we respond and react to Charleston? And I want to begin with you, Reverend Doctor. As a pastor, this tragedy took place in a sanctuary. How do we respond? And how do we stay faithful?
Sure. Well, first of all, we can't ignore it. As much of a tragedy as it has been and as it currently is, the one thing we do not want to do is sweep it under the carpet or ignore it. So we have to actually talk about it, and we have to ask ourselves some very serious questions. I was meeting that same hour and the Bible study on a Wednesday, and we let out at the exact same time at 9 o'clock. So it could have happened in any one of the churches, houses of worship, or synagogues who were meeting on that night for Bible study. And so I think it has to be directed, in terms of the question, direct the question to the proper people. And in this case, it's pastors. And I've had many people ask, Pastor, what was God up to that God would allow something like this to happen? But you have to ask those questions in order to get to healing.
Yes.
You have to. If the community is going to heal, the congregations are going to heal across this land, then we have to address that and those questions. I believe God was there. When people ask me, well, where was God? I believe God was there. And I believe God was comforting those who were victimized by it through, a sense of His presence. And I believe that gave them a sense of peace. But we also must seek that peace in community.
Yes, and it's such a tragedy. It's almost it's incomprehensible. But I'd like to ask you, Nancy, from the coalition, first talk a little bit about what the coalition does, the wonderful work that the Coalition on Race does, and then how is the coalition responding or helping our community to respond and react to the tragedy in Charleston?
Well, the Coalition is an integration organization. It's been around for about 20 years. It started in 1996, so we're about to celebrate our 20th anniversary next year. We work on race-conscious strategies in all aspects of community life all throughout the year. So we're touching on race-related issues in the schools. We have an interfaith outreach committee. That's how we know one another. We have social programs that bring people together over shared interests so that people can build relationships across racial lines, which is critical to successful integration. We work on marketing and housing issues. We work on racial representation and leadership in the community. I'm sure I'm missing a few things right now, but those are the general areas. And we've been at it for, like I said, about 20 years. Most recently, to get to the specific topic, each year we have an event called Conversations on Race. It's a kind of signature event for us. It's been going on for 15 years. We have a different topic, different presenters, sometimes a panel, sometimes a speaker, but the whole goal is to get people around small tables talking to one another, and we make sure that those tables are racially integrated.
So what are people saying at those tables? If I could put my finger on the pulse of that conversation, what are people saying?
Well, this year's Conversations on Race took place in May. And it was prior to this most recent unfortunate event, but there were plenty that happened prior. So some of those things came up. The topic was microaggressions, and we did have somebody present that. So what we were trying to do, and we were building from last year's topic, which was implicit or unconscious bias. So we were trying to build on that topic and get people to understand that people face all kinds of discrimination and bias and prejudice throughout their day that is sometimes unintended even by well-meaning people.
Yes.
And sometimes it's hard for white people to hear that, but it's a good conversation to have, and it's a good conversation to have face-to-face with people of different backgrounds, cultures, ethnicities, ages. Age is really important
Yes.
in the conversation as well, because we all have different experiences, depending on when we were born, when we were growing up.
Yes.
If we're products of the civil rights era, if we're more products, if we're younger people and we understand the language better. So we did have a different range of ages at these tables.
Because we can't create any change. We have to start with awareness. If we are at least aware, then empathy can develop.
Yes.
If empathy is developed once we have become aware, we can then begin to move in the direction of action. So you're right. It's this issue of race and the disparities. It cuts across so many age or socioeconomic
Yes.
status, but it's something that our country is grappling with because it's deep.
Yes.
And is it here just below the surface? Because I understand from talking with people in Charleston that it's not below the surface there.
Right.
It's very overt. So is it in our two towns? Is it simply simmering below the surface? Do you feel, or are we really having dialogue and continuing to create that awareness, which leads to empathy and action?
I think as a community, we really are intentional about it. We have been marketing this community for a long time to attract people here who believe in that effort of intentional integration and true inclusion. So if you move here, you really know what you're getting into, and that you will be living with people of different races and backgrounds in ways that you will not find in many other communities anywhere, any other suburbs across the country. We're a very rare phenomenon, and it's a wonderful thing that's happening here, and we do try to be a model for the nation, but that doesn't mean that we're immune to racism and the issues that the rest of the country faces. So yes, there are things that simmer below the surface, and I think that's why, as a community, we really wanted to talk about implicit bias and microaggressions, because most people here, no one really expects overt racism. It does happen, but the other kinds of forms of racism that I just mentioned are just as damaging, if not more damaging, especially when you're trying to live in community with one another.
Give us a definition of those two types.
The microaggressions are like the daily assaults that people of color face, sometimes mostly unintended and by well-meaning people. So an example might be a store owner or worker is not realizing that their eyes are following a black person walking through the store, but they are, and that person feels it. Or doesn't really, and
yes.
we do hear reports of that, especially we often hear this from youth, that they're not always comfortable in the businesses. And we don't think that anybody intends this, but you want people to be aware that you might have a response that is not on the surface even for you. If you ask somebody, my daughter had this experience, she goes to Rutgers, a very diverse school. Somebody was talking to her and said, well, where is so-and-so really from? And she said, she's from Bergen County. And she said, no, really from? And she said, if you're asking about her heritage, ask about her heritage.
Yes.
But she is from Bergen County.
Yes.
So these are the kinds of things, there are many, many, many examples, but
Sure.
but that is, those are examples of microaggressions. And implicit bias is connected because it's those sort of unconscious ways that we make judgments and act on things based on sort of visceral reactions that sometimes we don't really have access to, but they're part of our, cultural or national psyche that we're trying to undo.
So how do we help people? So we help them to become aware, but how do we help them not execute those behaviors? How does that really happen? Because that's a tough one.
It is a tough
I mean, to self-select and say, gee, I'm an unintended offender, but
it's a huge education, right? And this is the kind of thing that you do as well. A lot of talking, a lot of people sharing, building relationships, telling personal stories so that we get to know one another.
Yes.
And we are in that unique position here where we can share those stories. There are other communities where, definitely in New Jersey, where you don't have a mix of races. So the experience is, I really only know white people. Most of the country lives in racial isolation from one another.
Yes, and that's the beauty of South Orange Maplewood, is that we are not in that isolation. That's why my husband and I chose this as our home 19 and a half years ago, because we love the diversity, and you're right, we moved knowing what we would expect. And I'm wondering, how is the ecumenical community responding, specifically to the tragedy in Charleston, because it took place in a church?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me just say...
And does something logistically change with worship as a result of this?
I want to give credit to Nancy and the folks over at the Community Coalition on Race for what they do, and I think they should be applauded in every sense of the word. That's intentional. It's intentional wanting to build relationships that are non-biased. As an example, as you asked your question, the ecumenical community in South Orange and Maplewood we've come together. On Wednesday, this incident happened in Charleston. By Friday, we were on the phone, we were texting, we were emailing. The thought was, okay, let's do something for Monday, and the thought came to me, no, let's do something for Friday. I didn't want to immediately, because people are hurting and they really need some kind of response from the ecumenical community. And so we came together in a great way. And on this past Friday at 5:30, from 5:30 to 6, we were at the South Orange train station having a solidarity moment where we brought the community together, and all the houses of worship in South Orange and Maplewood came together. And we stood as one voice in the South Orange Maplewood community, saying we show solidarity, and we stand in solidarity with the Charleston, South Carolina community and the Emmanuel AME Church.
It's powerful. It's powerful. We will be right back. This is the South Orange Report with my guest, Reverend Dr. Terry L. Richardson, and Nancy Gagne, Executive Director of the South Orange Maplewood Coalition on Race. Stay tuned.
Television is a powerful and influential medium that allows different groups the opportunity to produce programming that directly affects their own communities. Public, educational, and government access channels ensure that all people, regardless of race, age, gender, disability, religion, or economic status, have access to local government information and the use of a public communication forum. Make sure everyone has a voice. Support your local PEG channels.
Welcome back to the South Orange Report. I am here with Nancy Gagne, the Executive Director of the South Orange Maplewood Coalition on Race, and Reverend Dr. Terry L. Richardson, and we are talking about how our very special communities, South Orange and Maplewood, have been responding and reacting to the recent tragedy in Charleston.
Yes, the Clergy Association just simply came together, said we have to do something. The community is hurting and needs healing. And as I was saying on Friday, in the evening, we just simply got together, and there was an outpouring of residents that came from both South Orange and Maplewood. Both chiefs were there, police chiefs of both towns were there. Both mayors were there, including our own village president, Sheena Collum, was there, as well as Mayor DeLuca. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful outpouring. The ecumenical community came together and offered prayers and poems, and we sang songs together. There were tears. But we wanted wanted to show solidarity and stand in solidarity with those who are hurting.
We really are in a special community. I wanted to share with you that a Zumba teacher in our community decided that the proceeds from the Zumba class should go to one of the Zumba classmates who tragically lost an aunt in Charleston. So this is a community, a set of communities that really cares about their people. And I want to get back to you, Nancy. How are we responding and reacting from the perspective of the coalition?
Sure. Well, first I want to commend Reverend Richardson for pulling together the vigil on such short notice. It was really a very special event, and we were happy to promote it in the short time that we had and get people out and to participate. It was really something important moment of healing.
Because we're all the same in those moments. We recognize that we feel deeply, and it could have been any of us.
And to come together on such a short notice,
Yes.
and that's what the remarkable thing was for me, to see the community show up. And as Nancy said, we really didn't have a lot of time. They didn't get a lot of notice, but when the Community Coalition of Race got noticed, they were there. And so it's really remarkable.
Yeah. And we generally think in terms of long-term strategies. So I don't often, on behalf of the coalition, think about these sort of quick responses. But my personal response, and I know this is true from other people, that in the midst of the difficult and painful moment, it really is important to come together and reflect with community members. So it really was something quite special. But to get back to your question about, what's the coalition hearing, we happened to have on Thursday night, which was just a day after the murders, we had scheduled the first in a series of events called Coffee House Conversations.
Yes.
And this developed out of, as I said before, we have conversations on race every year. It draws a huge crowd, between 100 and 160 people gathered at small tables. But people, we can't get them out of the room at the end of the night. They build relationships in that short time. They're happy to talk to one another. They want to keep going. So people said, can't we do this more times during the year? And each year we thought, well, we're busy with other things. But since all of these things have happened across the nation, we thought, well, that could be our response, giving people that opportunity to come together and talk, reflect, develop positive action steps for our own community within those conversations, and also build relationships. So the first one was held at the RAC on Springfield Avenue in Maplewood. We had about 22 people, different ages, races, more women than men probably, but there were definitely a few men there as well. The conversations were amazing because whereas our conversations on race, we have a topic and we focus people on something. This really allowed people to express what was on their minds. We did have opening questions and we have a facilitator. We try to keep it safe and comfortable for everyone in the room. But what we heard is questions like, why do people hate so deeply? What are the fears? Why is there such deep-seated racism? Could it happen in our community? We tried not to speculate too much about what's happening outside, but we try to think about what is it that we're doing here that might forestall something like that. And again, I can't put the emphasis enough on building relationships and, as Terry says, building community. So that's where we are.
Thank you, Nancy, because the other component, mental illness, there are other factors that create some of these horrific tragedies, but to ensure that we have dialogue, that the members of our community are talking, and we want to be here. We want to be in a community that's inclusive and that's diverse. That's really very important. And I think that the work that the coalition is doing is keeping the conversations going. Yeah. That's critical, because people do need a place, a safe place to have the conversation. I remember one of the members of our community said to me, I recognize that I was born in a class of superiority, or a protected class,
privileged,
if you will. Privileged is the word I was searching for. And she said, gee, it's not my fault. It's just the luck of the parental, the family draw. but she said, but now I'm aware.
Yes. Yeah.
And so the responsibility, she said, it's incumbent upon me to not only do something different, but to model a different behavior for my children. Because I do think it can change, but it's many, many years that
Right.
have to be changed. And I think from South Pacific, you've got to be taught
Right.
to hate and fear. I mean, that was way ahead of its time.
Yes.
And I want to know, how will things change logistically? Because when things happen, like 9/11, we have different security in place. When the tragedy happened in the school, we put different things in place. What happens inside of take us, if you will, to a church on the corner? What happens differently as a result of something like Charleston? How do we keep it homey and community-like,
Yeah.
but be mindful that we need to keep our people safe as much as we can?
Well, one of the things that Charleston does is that as tragic as that incident is, it brings us an awareness that we all are vulnerable, even in our houses of worship.
Yep.
And
Yes.
so it brings a heightened awareness of the need for some forms of security. Most houses of worships are inviting. We invite people where we enjoy having people. But at the same time, how do you protect your faith community from whether it's mental illness or just all-out hate?
Yes.
And so I had a meeting in Newark with a bunch of pastors from the area that we talked about Homeland Security. There's a meeting on the 29th where Homeland Security will meet with a bunch of pastors in the area,
Wonderful.
whoever wants to come, and we'll talk about security and how to be aware and what type of security you need. They will also, from my understanding, do free security analysis at our houses of worship if we ask. And so the change for us has been, be aware of your surrounding at all times and actually have trained individuals or some type of security monitoring system in place, whether that be electronic, digital, or people. And just to be an intense, heightened awareness of your surroundings at all times. Yeah.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
But it's necessary.
Yeah.
So we have to evolve to that which is necessary.
Yeah, and this has caused me to start journaling about racism and researching racism myself, and coming up with theses and hypotheses, if you will, simply because time after time and time again, we are recently seeing just stress and strain when it comes to racial or race relations
And
racial
racial tensions.
tensions. And so I've been journaling, I've been researching, and we'll see where it goes from there. But I'm even thinking about a book, if you will, some kind of article on it, because people are asking those questions,
Yes.
Nancy. They're asking, why do people hate? Where does racism come
Yeah.
from? And
Because how do we help our children? Because you mentioned that at the table conversations there were young people. What are we saying to the young people? We
Right.
are the models. What are we saying to the young people?
There are good conversations going on in the schools that we're really excited about, and we have to work with teachers as well, and that's something that the Community Coalition on Race does, offering cultural competency workshops and workshops for parents called Talking to Your Children About Race. And within the schools, Diversity Rocks at the high school level is very engaged in talking to peers about race and racism. And it's an important ongoing conversation. And I just wanted to add about the hate issue. The subtitle of this year's conversation on race was Facing Everyday Racism. And I know there is a tendency with Charleston to say this is an extreme form of hatred that no one can fathom, and it's one person, or it's guns, or it's mental illness, or it's drugs, or there are so many things that you can use to deflect what's at the heart,
basic
which
core.
is
Sure,
racism.
sure.
And it is born of everyday racism. That deep-seated racism comes from somewhere. And
Sure.
even in a community like ours, we have to be facing it all the time.
And I think it takes courage to
Yes.
face it. And
It does.
to talk about it, because you're right. It is deep-seated. I mean, this tragedy happened on the anniversary of something important to the African American community,
Right.
to our history. But it's the deep-seated racism that drove that action. And you're right, we have to work on it every day
Yeah.
because we exist in this world together.
It's a tough conversation to have, but it's a needed conversation. We must have this conversation as a community, and I believe also as a country. I believe
agree.
we need to. And again, I commend the Community Coalition on Race. I commend the South Orange Maplewood Clergy Association. But I also commend our police chiefs. Coffee with the Cop,
Yes.
police chiefs, the Public Safety Committee, of South Orange, as well as Maplewood. The Coffee with the Cop was a wonderful thing. It's a way to say, hey, at least in law enforcement, let's recognize that our law enforcement do a great job in our two communities. And so let's come together and just have dialogue and conversation, getting to know one another. Working with the Clergy Association is working with the Maplewood Police Department to form an alliance, Maplewood Police Department and Clergy Alliance program. Again, it's a way to kind of debunk some of these myths about law enforcement and teens of color, men of color, and at the same time, build that. One of my favorite words is to build that community. So I must commend. There are some organizations and people in town that want to have that conversation and not afraid to have that
And the
conversation.
that's why we're here.
townships as well. I want to give a shout out to both the leadership in South Orange and Maplewood. Way back when Ferguson happened, we asked them to develop a resolution. Ours was a little on the negative side. They made it a very strong affirmation that supports all the groups that come together to work on these issues in communities. So
That's wonderful. That's why we're here.
Yeah.
We chose a community that believes in inclusivity, and it's a work in progress.
Yes.
We've got to keep talking. So thank you to Nancy and the Coalition on Race for all the good work that you do. And I encourage my fellow villagers to find out more about the coalition and get involved. And thank you, Reverend Dr. Richardson, and all the work that you're doing with the ecumenical community around this and all the other important issues in town.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate you both coming out and talking.
thanks for
Thank you.
South Orange
Yes,
report.
by all
Thank
means.
you.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
And this is not the end. We'll be
No.
talking again on many other things.
We have lots of issues we can go talk about.
and hopefully they will be all thought-provoking and allow
Yeah.
community to get involved, because we have
Sure.
to figure out how to provide an opportunity for the community to talk back.
Yes.
Yeah,
at
yes,
South Orange
yes,
report.
yes, yes.
Yeah,
That's
well,
on my-
we have lots of public events. People
Wonderful.
can join in.
Wonderful. So thank you both for coming. Really appreciate it. This is the South Orange Report. Thank you.